Welcome to Design Talks Now, the virtual version of Design Talks hosted by Design Pavilion in celebration of NYC by Design. I'm Eileen Shaw, producer of Design Pavilion, New York's public design exhibition held annually in the public plazas of Times Square, with a mission to increase awareness of design thinking, the process, and projects. Design Talks explore topics of the future, resiliency, sustainability, and humanity. And we're honored to share programming developed with our forward-thinking partners. Such programs play an important role in thoughtfully documenting our experience during this extraordinary time in history. You are contributing to this time capsule, as well as inspiring what comes next. Now we're pleased to present Pipeline for the Future, how exhibition designers and architects are reimagining the future. Moderated by William Hanley, editor-in-chief of Dwell magazine, and panelists Abigail Honor, principal at Lorem Ipsum, Barbara Miller, director of curatorial affairs at the Museum of the Moving Image, Kevin Murphy, director of sales and marketing at Craftwork Living Technologies, and Bevin Savage Yamazaki, civic and culture leader and senior associate at Gensler. And now, let's begin.
Thanks everyone for joining. I'm William Hanley. I'm the editor-in-chief of Dwell magazine, and I'm excited to be hosting this panel with a group of people working at the intersection of design and physical space. So we have Abby Honor, the founding partner of Lorem Ipsum, an experienced design company headquartered in New York with offices in London and Moscow. Barbara Miller, the director of curatorial affairs at the Museum of Moving Image here in New York. Kevin Murphy, the director of sales and marketing at Craftwork Living Technologies. And Bevin Savage Yamazaki, head of the civic and culture practice at Gensler. Hi, guys. Thanks so much for joining.
Hi. Hi.
So as I mentioned, everyone on the panel is working somewhere at the intersection of digital technology and physical space, whether it's on exhibition design, on installations for brands, on interior design and architecture. And I wanted to ask just a little bit about kind of the state of the field. What in the last 10 years are the sorts of experiences that you've been creating? And what are some of the concerns and developments that have gone on there? And maybe, Abby, we can start with you on the Lorem Ipsum side. You work with a wide range of clients, so it would be great to get a little bit of an overview of your work and how that's evolved.
Yeah, sure. So we work with lots of different clients, from museums and institutions to brands. And I think sort of the landscape has completely changed over the last decade, which has allowed this sort of confluence between technology and physical space to happen. I think traditional museums, for example, have been totally sort of turned on their head, and participation and interaction have really been encouraged over the last decade. And so we've seen, with this sort of encouraging to touch and feel and immerse yourself in the actual exhibition, and sometimes with the artifacts themselves, you've also seen digital technology advance significantly. So I think the whole landscape in general has changed. And when we look at digital technology, the sort of digital technologies Lorem Ipsum uses, we start with visually, and we've seen camera resolution has completely changed from 35mm, we all went to HD, then 4K, 6K, 8K. So we've sort of seen the scale of the imagery that we could make really increase significantly. And that's lent itself to an evolution in the way that we project and how we show media, for example. So our canvas has moved from a more typical sort of screen to basically the sky's the limit. It can be the floor, it can be the ceiling, it can be the walls. So we've really seen a crazy intersection between media and physical space. And then when we look at audio, originally it was Dolby surround sound and a very simple stereo mono. And today, even with the exhibition like over at Brooklyn Museum for David Bowie, you have sort of user activated sounds and proximity indicators so that you can really create a completely different immersive experience. So that's sort of what we've seen happen in terms of the physical space merging with digital technology. It's allowed us to create physical environments, replicate physical environments that also marry very nicely media together, creating these truly transportive experiences that completely overwhelm the visitor and tell the story in this really unique, immersive way. So one of the pieces we did at the Platov Airport, which was built a couple of years ago for the World Cup, was a huge 360-degree surround architectural ring of a beast, which had media all the way around. We wouldn't have been able to do that probably 4 or 5 years ago. So being able to sort of mix this physical space with digital technology is super exciting, especially as technology constantly is evolving and we're coming up with ways to use it effectively in these spaces. And we're always a slave to, okay, what's the story? Sort of trying to balance the education and the entertainment side. So we also recently created another very large screen that made it look like you were in a trench overlooking the landscape and you could see the battle coming towards you. Another thing that's really exciting is we could actually put people in situations that maybe we wouldn't have been able to do before. So yeah, that's sort of some of the things that we're exploring.
That's very cool. I'm also really happy that you brought up the Bowie show at the Brooklyn Museum. I think that was a spectacular example of how media can enhance a journey through a progression of spaces, and not only activate the physical objects in the collection, but create a sense of time and character and narrative evolving. I'd love to ask Barbara a bit about how that has come into play with what the Museum of the Moving Image has been doing from an exhibition and teaching side. How have you been able to activate the collection and create different exhibitions around exhibitions using new technologies?
Thanks. I think there's an enormous opportunity to amplify aspects of a story, to go deeper into collection objects, to kind of overcome the realities, the sort of space-time reality where you can't have more than one object next to each other. With digital tools, you can actually do that using kind of interactive and digital technologies that allow you to go deeper into your collections while only presenting one thing. So all of those are fantastic tools that we have used, I think, to great success in providing more access to collection objects and to tell a deeper story. I think for us, and I'll sort of ring the cautionary note here, maybe. We have a material culture collection, right? So our subject is the moving image. Ultimately, the subject is the stories as they're told on the screen. But we have a material culture collection. We're not a film and television archive. So we have cameras and projectors and costumes and photographs and licensed merchandise and all of these things that have to do with the production, promotion, and exhibition of the moving image in all its forms. So we have video games, arcade games, all these kinds of things, all these artifacts. And obviously we do and have always used the moving image, used sort of screens in a sense, as a way to contextualize the material culture that we have. So we're accustomed to balancing artifactual experiences with screen experiences, and then an overlay on top of that with interactive experiences and invite audiences to kind of have their hands on things so they know how things work. And that's, we I think really innovated that decades ago with combining moving image on screens, on artifacts, and interactive experiences that let you go deeper, as in addition to artworks that help interpret our story. But I think what I'm finding and what I'm noticing in a large scale is that as these digital technologies get perhaps as they proliferate and perhaps get more affordable to certain areas of the museum field, but certainly not all, that there is a danger that they overwhelm the story. And that if they're not married really, really closely with the story that you're trying to tell, then they become the story. And I feel like my job, right, as I'm not an exhibition designer, I'm someone that has to pick and choose among those technologies to harness them to tell a deeper story, to tell an organic story, to tell something that to sort of realize a story in physical space. I am very careful, right, about the things that we choose, because I don't want those sort of shiny experiences that really are fun to overwhelm the story that we're trying to tell. So that's kind of the note that I want to bring to this is just sort of taking those steps carefully and slowly, and with advisement to sort of make sure that you're telling the story organically that you're meant to tell.
Can you give an example of a show that really pulled that off, that sticks out in your mind?
Sure.
Or even a moment within a show?
Yeah, we have an ongoing exhibition at the museum called the Jim Henson Exhibition, which you may guess is about Jim Henson and his career and his collaboration with these great puppeteers and writers and performers from the mid 50s up until sadly he passed away in the 90s. And it's an incredible, rich exhibition with puppets and other artifacts and interactive experiences that give you a sense of what that creative journey was like. And of course, there's a lot of moving image content. So again, we have that balance between these artifacts, right? These puppets and all these other things that we want to give people a chance to come face to face with and have a moment to kind of absorb them and not just be overwhelmed in a space, right? So as we were working, with our designers and coming up with these sort of moments within that journey, one of the key moments in Henson's career was the realization of the Muppet Show. After about 15 years of trying to get a network to buy into it, finally it came to fruition. So we have galleries that explore his work from the 50s on and all these kinds of things. And finally, we're in an area where the Muppet Show has sort of come to fruition. And as you enter that space, you have puppets, you have these other things, but there's an installation. It's a grid of all 120 episodes of the Muppet Show playing at once. You're seeing all this content and you're having this experience and you're immersed in this projection, but it's not just sort of a shiny, like, wow moment. It is those things, but it's also communicating through this digital technology, this feeling of, wow, this finally happened, right? The moment that the feeling that's trying to evoke is something that we are saying that Jim Henson and his collaborators felt. So we're trying to sort of marry the audience experience with the story that we're trying to tell, if that makes sense. So that's sort of like the most kind of big tech, in a sense, that we got with that show, and we wanted to keep it scaled so that we didn't overwhelm the story with those kinds of experiences, but we used it really selectively.
That's a great example. It really does highlight, I'm a big fan of that exhibition, and it really does highlight the way that the technology can enhance but not take over the narrative. And it really is this moment when the visual activates the physical space, and kind of vice versa, for this really affective moment with the viewer. And I mean, Kevin, you've done this across all sorts of different arenas, not only sort of in the context of an exhibition, but also all sorts of different types of physical spaces. Can you say a little bit about Craftwork, kind of how that got started, and what the studio is doing these days?
I'm probably the grey-haired one in the room to a certain extent, and I started actually before 1977, but 1977 was the Natural History Museum in London, which is one of the major institutes. And we were very much at the cutting edge of moving technology into galleries where before there were glass cases. It was really quite a revolutionary time because the curators were up in arms against what we were doing, but we were developing new types of exhibitions to entertain as well as educate the public. And I was there for 10 years, And that's really where I started as a technical interpreter. That's what I call myself. I spend a lot of time working with designers and clients, trying to understand what they're trying to do and then working out how you can do it and how much. And the how much question quite often comes in. So fundamentally, I'm used to putting technology in, but I'll pick up on an important point from Barbara that I'm one of the first people that gets very grumpy when people apply technology in the early discussion. And I hate nothing worse than talking to a design team where, right, we're going to have a big display, it's going to be X meters by X meters, it's going to be big and bright. And I ask why, and they don't know why. Because the thing is with technology, technology is a tool and it needs content and it needs stuff to make it work, to tell the story. The best technology exhibits or attractions I've ever worked on, the visitor or the guest forgets that the technology is there. That's the whole point.
Yep.
I spent 10 years then at the Natural History Museum. I then went on to the commercial world. So I started selling technology, but I haven't changed my tune. I still am very, very cautious about applying technology the right way. I worked for a major technology integrator for 20 years, worked my way through there, got to travel the world and opened offices around the world. And that allowed me to work with different designers and also get into theme parks and more entertainment. And then the brand name started to pop up in the early 90s, where brand centers were a big thing. I left about 2007. I actually then joined a design company for a number of years. So worked on the inside, working with designers, basically doing my technical interpretation and working on lots of projects like Titanic Belfast. Belfast is the capital city of Northern Ireland. It's a major city where the Titanic was built. It's there, it's authentic. That's another word that comes up when we're using technology. Try to keep it authentic. You know, we could see the slipway where the Titanic was built. Don't try and duplicate that with technology. Try to use the real thing. That was a fabulous project. And then I joined Craftwork about 4 years ago. Craftwork Living Technologies, we're a company of about 130 people. We're based in Austria, but all of our work is from China to the US. We're in Bali at the moment. We're in Doha. We're at Dubai in the Expo. We're in Russia. We're all over. And fundamentally, we're delivering technology for museums and exhibitions, but also for entertainment and theme parks. And this is the first role in my life, towards, I suppose, the latter stage of my life, where I'm getting into major attractions for mass audiences. So a lot of what I'm doing now isn't for just 1 or 2 people to look at in small exhibits. It's for 1,000 people to enjoy at a time, which is a totally different type of challenge. But again, the same principles apply. If we're doing a big media-based attraction, it's still about the content. Our bit has to work extremely well and deliver a result, but it's the story that counts.
Mm-hmm.
So can you give an example of, I mean, it's really interesting to go from the scale of a museum exhibition, which may attract a whole bunch of people, to this really mass experience with some of the things that you've been working on in the last few years. Can you give an example of a really successful experience for 1,000 people all at once?
Well, 1,000 is a high number. I mean, we worked about 5 years ago, just before I joined, on a 1,000-seat 4D theatre. Now, don't groan when you hear the term 4D theatre. A well-designed 4D theatre basically uses movement in the seats. It uses special effects, a very big screen and a big display with all sorts of tricks to basically take you on a journey. If you can imagine a theatre with 1,000 moving seats, it's quite something to look at. And I think we get about 33,000 people, not at the moment, but on a normal day, if there is a normal day ever again, 33,000 people a day going through that attraction. And that's for a Chimelong Park in South China. And that has been amazingly successful and holds the Guinness World Record for the largest 4D theatre and the largest 3D screen in the world. But more recently, I mean, I'll take an example of a slightly smaller attraction. It still gets people through, but flying theatres. We work a lot on flying theatres. Now, I mean, it's weird in a funny sort of way. I've always wanted to work on flying theatres because I remember going to the one at Epcot in the early 90s, soon after it opened. And I just enjoyed it. It was a great experience. And fundamentally, in a flying theatre, there's various ways you get there, but you sit in seats, you buckle up, and you go up to a height, and you're immersed in a dome screen, and you experience flying over cities, over mountains. And these days with CGI, you can immerse yourself in a cartoon character's world, whatever. Highly successful. But it doesn't have to be on such a huge scale. I mean, we just worked on a flying theatre in Iceland, in Reykjavik. It'll have 300,000 people a year. And it's been designed and built as a purpose-built attraction to make money. A lot of the work that I do is there to make money at the end of the day, fundamentally. And it looks like it's going to be very, very successful. And again, of course, it comes down to how the film was made. In that particular case, it's a live shooting where high-resolution cameras are used to film all the sights of Iceland. And you can go to that show and you can experience Iceland. And not only that, if you want to, you can take people in the same venue to Taiwan or Vancouver or Toronto or even Moscow. Great fun if you haven't tried one. I know, Abby, you have.
And I guess, you know, that's very different, although similar in some ways to what, Bevan, you're working on in terms of interior design and architecture. The way that the filmmaking and the physical experience kind of play into one another is really important for making those kinds of experiences work. Bevan, when you're thinking about the interior space, how does the media production come into play?
So I think this is pretty funny to segue after Kevin's comments, because as a self-confessed Luddite, I would say that when I think about technology and when I think about you know, media within like the workplace or within, you know, the civic realm, which is really where my focus is that it's really, you know, spaces that are sort of flirting with technology, that, you know, really where it works best to me is always when it feels more ambient. It's a little bit more in the background. It's sort of supporting the experience, but really always at the forefront is like the human experience and how people are actually using the space. And to me, that's what makes successful architecture. What I would say has been sort of changing over the last couple of years in our industry clearly is this sort of real focus on AI and sort of data analytics and sort of bringing that realm in to not only better manage and sort of measure buildings, right? So whether it's going through sensor technology or machine learning as ways to really think about creating high performance buildings, which is something that, you know, we have a team at Gunsler that's really focused on that. You know, that's a great way to sort of improve the human experience, but again, a little bit in the background. So you can kind of go about your way, but there are sensors kind of mapping the way you move through the space so that, you know, your heating and cooling technologies can react to the number of people in the space, but that it's not a major focus for you. I would say also that this sort of data-driven design is really about sort of allowing us to sort of tailor and adapt buildings that are already built to sort of be better sort of serviced and used by people every day. But again, I think as I sort of look at our practice, sort of, again, more kind of cultural and more civic focused, it's really about creating that balance by really identifying these sort of more lo-fi experiences and balancing it then again with the technology so that it's really a support to how we're having that space sort of work for people that use it every day.
Can you think of an example of something that's been really successful lately in terms of recalibrating the architecture using some of these AI systems?
Yeah, so we actually did a project really recently, the PNC Tower, which really is a completely smart building. So all of the facade sort of adapts and works depending on where the sun is sort of in the sky. The heating and cooling sort of adapts to the shutters on the building opening and closing. And then inside, again, it's sort of a sensor-driven kind of an environment. And we're also in our office in New York have been sort of testing this sort of sensor sort of driven environment where we have many of our colleagues who are working on one of our floors. You know, it shows how people move around. And this is sort of one of our experimental floors where we have more of a hoteling system. shows where people are sitting, how often people are sort of occupying that space. So while we're sort of talking to our clients about, you know, the potential for this, we want to understand how it works for us as well, so that we're really sort of sharing that, you know, sort of, I would say, relevant data with them. So it's sort of a bit of an ongoing experiment. Clearly, we've not been in the office for a few weeks, but hopefully when we go back, we'll be kind of picking that up again and moving that forward, and then sharing some of those technologies and sort of, you know, responses with our clients.
What have you learned about your colleagues' behavior from that?
People are really busy. there's a lot of like walking around and moving from spaces to space. I mean, one of the things that we've certainly learned, at least from the work environment, is that, you know, choice of like environment is really, really important. So people don't want to sit at their desk like for 10 hours a day. They want to be able to get up, grab a cup of coffee, have a kind of more informal meeting, sitting on the couch in the cafe for like 20 minutes, then getting up and going and sitting maybe in a room where they can take a private call, and then moving back to their desk for 10 minutes. So that sort of dynamism and movement in the workplace, I think, is definitely a positive, right? You're not sort of sitting there focused at your desk. And I certainly know as architects and designers, we tend to spend a lot of time at the office. So this is sort of, again, a way to sort of encourage that sort of movement. And again, leading to this whole idea of health and wellness, which is sort of a great byproduct of really this sort of drive towards technology within the workplace.
That's an interesting transition, because I want to ask about the role that the rise of mobile technology, different distributed ways of working, and social media has played in the evolution of these physical experiences, whether it's, you know, how we work, or it's how we encounter an exhibition, or how we're entertained. You know, what have the biggest effects, whether it's on the exhibition side or in the workplace setting, what are the biggest effects of that?
I was going to start with a slight negative, because there's no harm in exploring some of the negatives. I think certainly when I go back to a lot of my exhibition work a few years back, and even more recently, one of the problems with social media is an odd one. People are actually used to devices. People are used to using smartphones and devices. And the problem is, in a lot of exhibitions, people are trying to replicate that in many ways. And because you're used to a very, very good touchscreen on a mobile phone, trying to replicate that on a larger screen within an exhibition is actually not that easy. And I've come across, I'm not going to name any examples, but quite a few exhibitions where, you know, designers, and I'm the first to blame myself when I get something wrong, but sometimes designers will, you know, they've got a subject to tell. Well, let's put an interactive in. Let's put an interactive in. Let's put an interactive in. I've actually had those conversations. And there's 2 or 3 problems. Yes, people are used to using very, very sensitive technology close to their face, and very, very responsive and very, very personal. You can't replicate that on a larger screen. And it gets even harder when you're dealing with a group. The design of group interactives, we could probably have a 3-hour session in its own right, and not many people get it right. It's very, very hard. But so the impact of the technology, it's not so much the social media, but it's the fact that you're using it, has affected a lot of how the exhibitions are designed and built this way. And just because you can, again, doesn't mean you should.
And, you know, Abby and Barbara, I mean, on the exhibition design side too, you see more or less successful uses of interactive moments within that. But on the social media side, I mean, there is a sense that, you know, even if you don't explicitly create the moment for people to share within a show, they will do it. So how has the way that you've incorporated technology into physical exhibitions kind of accounted for that, reacted to that?
I'll just say super quickly, it's funny, we, again, I'll tack back to this Jim Henson exhibition. It kind of originated for us. We had a temporary show that was organized by the Smithsonian in 2012. And at that point, visitors weren't allowed to take pictures in the exhibition, and it was really hard, right, for our security team to get people to not do that. A few years later, 5 years later, we opened up our ongoing show, and the mood, the sort of acknowledgement of social media as a way to enhance your own brand as a museum, the brand of the intellectual property that's inside your exhibition, the sort of moving exhibition content beyond the physical space into people's lives, into communities of practice that had been so acknowledged by that time that it was like, of course you can take pictures when you're in the show, because that's, you know, that's a part of it. It's like you're having that experience, and then you're extending it through, you know, through the photos that you take and that you post, and that, you know, becomes sort of like a free pipeline of advertising. So I think, I mean, there's a lot of ways to talk about social media and its relationship to museums, exhibitions. That's one, right? So we want people to have a great experience when they're at the museum. We want them to take pictures and to post them and to have conversations afterwards, because that's the point, right? Like, why are we doing this? Why am I doing this as a curator in a museum? I'm doing this so that people engage with the subject matter and that they carry it on with them, right? And if people nowadays are doing so much through their devices, then of course you're going to want to enable that and encourage that. So that's a really positive thing. On the negative side, I think people, you know, walking through an exhibition are, you know, it's really hard for us. Again, I'll come back to this idea of wanting to make sure that the time that you're spending with the collection, with the material culture, with the artifacts is not just through the lens of your phone, that you're actually in a space, having an experience, and not just mediating it through the pictures that you're taking. And we do see that a lot. You know, that I think that's something that all curators wrestle with and designers wrestle with is like what people are doing in that space, and how the social media that they're actually spawning in that space, how that's good, and then also what the downsides are.
I think that's really interesting, because I know that many years ago I worked on the Dia Beacon Museum up in Beacon, New York, and you know, at the time we completed that project in 2001, right? It's kind of a while ago. There was no social media, and very much the experience that you were encouraged to have was that very intimate one-on-one experience with the work. You know, since then you're now allowed to take photos there, but there's certain artists, Walter Demery in particular, you're not allowed to take any photos of his work. And that sort of came down as part of his, you know, legacy of how he wanted his work to be shared or discussed. And I think it's interesting. I really appreciated your point about, you know, like the advantages and the disadvantages, right? That sort of, that extra level of engagement, maybe in a lo-fi way, where you're really focused to have that one-on-one sort of experience with the work, as opposed to sort of stepping away and having that intermediary piece of technology that separates you, that mediates and really sort of directs how you view and share that work. So it's a challenge, I think, for all cultural organizations, when you sort of think about, you know, what experience you want your audience to have, you know, how the architecture frames that flow and that movement through the space, and then how the collection is sort of shared and experienced.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on Barbara and Bevan, actually. I think it comes down to what we were discussing earlier about technology, and only bringing that conversation in when you know what the narrative or what it is you'd like to communicate, whether you're an institution or a corporation. And so sort of understanding how and why you'd use social media, because we have a project we're working on right now, interestingly enough, which is about the nuclear arms race, and it's specifically located in a basement, and people have to turn in their phones before they go down there, and there's a reason for that. It's to keep it secret, make it feel like you're not accessing anything outside of this space, to really put you in the mindset of what the scientists were going through. And so I think, again, using social media as a tool, because at the other end of the landscape, you have that shareability, that awareness that Barbara spoke of. And then we're also creating some experiences now that use user-generated content. Now everybody's getting more and more savvy with not only just a still of themselves, maybe it's video, maybe it's some way that you are in the museum space recording yourself there. So it's creating this digital layer from coming, and then maybe also thinking about how you return, because I know a lot of museums are coming to us now saying, okay, we have this beautiful museum, but once you've been once, maybe twice, you're not coming back for a long, long time. You've been there, done that. So utilizing technologies to supplement further stories. I know for the Jewish Museum, for example, they needed us to tell an education story, the history of education, completely separately from what they were telling in the Jewish Museum. And we actually took the technology of drone glasses, believe it or not, where you can actually see visuals here. We augmented them and played with them a little bit. And so using a docent with an iPad, they could control the imagery that these groups of school children were seeing within the Jewish Museum, and they were seeing a completely different narrative. So using mobile technologies to help tell stories, as Barbara mentioned, in the right, relevant, appropriate manner. I think there's lots of ways to use that successfully, and not just like the Museum of Ice Cream way, where you look really pretty. Not telling anybody much, but I look pretty.
But that's the place for social media in many respects. It's outside the institute, wherever it will be. And it's about extending that story. I think, if you try to extend the social media practice and giving visitors a voice too much inside the gallery, you're missing a point, because you can do that at home. You can do that with your friends. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an old example, Museum of the Moving Image in London in the early 90s, way before social media. Hey, let's give visitors a voice. And there was a recording studio, and you could record on pneumatic tape in those days. Oh. You gave a group of people the chance to record something and play it back. Of course, it was abused, totally abused. People would record something whilst the tape was rewinding to replay. They'd run outside the gallery, and then what would play in the gallery was abusive. Now, you had to have security staff at that particular exhibit, so it defeated the objective. I think the main point there is be very careful when you give visitors a voice. You may not like what you hear.
Yeah, you have to curate it.
Yeah,
for sure.
That's a great sort of historical lesson, though, about how people will behave if given the opportunity. But there is, a deep understanding of psychology and other aspects of, human behavior that goes into creating these kinds of experiences in any context. And I'd love a few examples of what any of you have learned about the psychology of encountering technology in physical space, whether it's through how people interact with responsive exhibition elements, or if it's, when exactly the right moment to trigger their chair to vibrate in a in a theater is. I mean, what are some of the takeaways that, maybe someone involved in designing physical space should know about how people behave that's come up in your work?
Can I just jump in here, because it's our big pet peeve is people are not as intuitive or smart as you think. I always say I plan for my grandma. They miss, if it's not right there, the big red stop button, they won't hit it. If it's complex or takes more than a second to see, or you bombard them with too much information, it's a failure. We've had like a very steep learning curve over the years just with interactive devices, and in prototyping what you think is really, really clear, just they don't understand what to do. And so it's really been about designing so that you are really leading people from a physical design and an interactive perspective. Kevin, I don't know if you've also found that you've got to really make it really accessible for all age groups and incredibly basic.
It's got to be accessible to people of all shapes, sizes, disabilities, and so forth. And it's interesting to hear the word prototype again. Sorry, I keep going back over the years, but it's relevant to today. The one thing I do miss is evaluation. When again at the Natural History Museum, because we were so, we're talking late 70s, the technology was slide projectors and push buttons and lights. But virtually every major exhibit was evaluated. It would actually be built up and prototyped and actually tested with members of the public report. And so the evaluation officer was an important part of the museum. I actually wonder how many museums still have evaluation officers on the exhibition team. You might correct me. I'm looking at Barbara, you might correct me, but in a minute. And even when I worked in a design group, we didn't really do evaluation, not to such a huge extent. And that seems a bit of a shame. So it's good to hear that prototype word again.
Bevan, it's really central to what you're doing in the civic space too, just in terms of data collection and manipulating and shaping our understanding of how people use that space. What is the role of kind of prototyping and iteration within your work?
Yeah, so it's actually a great question. So a few years ago, we really wanted to try and kind of understand what actually a great experience was, right? Whether it was in a public place, whether it was in a museum, whether it was in the workplace, like what really constituted as a strong, powerful, successful experience. It's a tough one to evaluate because really it's sort of a mix between like the qualitative aspects of design, which, you know, are a little tougher to sort of measure, and then the quantitative. And then it's really a blend of the two. And so we started to kind of work on this sort of multi-year Gensler Experience Index, which began to, again, gather data, you know, interview over 4,000 people in a range of different places to kind of understand, well, like when you leave here, what made you feel good? Like, what was it about that experience? Was it the lighting? Was it something more physical? Was it something sort of like a little less quantifiable? And ultimately, the sort of the results were sort of similar in a lot of cases, that it was really about going to a place and having your sort of needs satisfied, right? And that's really what made a successful experience. And so how do you design around that? So I really wanted to sort of take a lot of that information and some of the framework that we had set up and apply it to museums. So last year, we interviewed about 2,000 museum goers across the US to really sort of learn, you know, when you come to the museum, what is it that makes you want to come back? What is it that made you sort of be filled with delight? Like what created that awe for that experience? And so much of it was about having balance. And it was balance between the lo-fi and the digital. It was about being able to come to a space with a whole set of like, you know, unstructured intentions and having the majority of them filled, which is a really tough thing to ask museums to be able to do, because that goes well beyond the architecture, and a lot of that is to do with the program. And then also it's this idea of creating spaces that are equitable, right? That everybody comes and arrives and feels welcomed, that there are, you know, bathrooms for everybody, that you can go where you want and you don't have to come up a set of steps or have somebody help you get in the building, that you can travel in with everybody. And so sort of that sort of blending of the physical space, the program, and then also that sort of need to sort of fulfill this sort of this human experience aspect, sort of all blended together. So it's a little tough to sort of say it's this and this and this. It really is kind of a careful woven blend of all of these aspects that sort of create a great architectural experience.
Can you give an example of when you've been really surprised by the results? You know, what resonated with people that was maybe contrary to the hypothesis that you set up the technology in the space to gather data on?
Yeah, so I mean, I would use sort of an example from the Museum of the Dog, which is a small museum that we completed about 1.5 years ago. They're located up on Park Avenue and 40th Street, and it's all focused on dogs, which, you know, is kind of amazing. So it's run by the American Kennel Club, and their whole focus and mission is really about educating people about purebreds, but then also sort of celebrating the sort of ongoing connection between humans and dogs. And they had this absolutely wonderful collection of like old dog paintings, right? Which when you think about it, may not seem maybe so fashionable nowadays. So our job was to sort of reinterpret this to sort of appeal to you know, a wider audience beyond what they call their supporters, which is the fancy, and so it would sort of engage with this sort of bigger audience, and then also young people and older people. So we started to think about, you know, that sort of blending of creating an app for them, so that if you wanted to engage in further interpretation, you could do that, or you could just stand there and look at the art and sort of experience the space. We also had a bunch of like technologies that we designed to sort of help with education. You can actually get your photo taken and then it turns into a dog that looks quite similar to you. I did not try that because I didn't want to know, but it's one of the most popular things in the museum. And so I think that really sort of a lot of the findings that we got about equity and balance within the space, and ensuring that you're sort of appealing to like all age groups. We sort of used a lot of our findings to sort of build in the experience for this museum, which I think actually, has worked out incredibly well. People are still fascinated by all of the strange tchotchkes that we've gathered, but they also still want to learn how to train a guard dog. So we sort of managed to kind of hit that balance on both sides.
That's a very cool program to be working with. So, I mean, all of these, all of your practices, require some amount of physical space and physical gathering. And, we're doing this interview digitally. What do you think we're going to learn from this moment where we can't physically gather that will inform your practices? I mean, is this something that, you see changing the field?
Yes. I do, and it's for somebody like me whose entire career has been focused on public gathering and community and bringing people together in all of its forms, whether it's in education, whether it's in the cultural fields. I think the one lesson that we're going to learn is that I think people are going to want to connect with lo-fi experiences after coming out of weeks upon weeks upon weeks of like this digital interaction and sort of be together. And I think organizations really do understand that people come first, but like place still matters. So I think people are going to want to create a sort of a sense of like trust between their organization and the public and their organization. So that sort of the knowledge that places will be kept clean, the knowledge that people are monitoring numbers of people as they move through space, and that sort of ongoing connection of their mission to this new world. I think all of that's going to be so important. But really, this is an opportunity for us. I mean, I think if we really start to think about this in a positive way, we can begin to accelerate some of our utilizations of technologies. I think that we can probably say the technology has advanced faster in the last 8 weeks than it has in several years. And so, like, how do we begin to like really embed that in a positive way? But again, I think it will be about bringing people together, but in a sort of a sensitive manner, and one that sort of focuses on people's health and wellness, always at the center of that. And I think there's going to be a lot of testing. We talked about prototypes before. There's going to be a lot of testing, seeing what's going to work, what's going to fail, and things that are successful. And I think it's going to be really very much about building this experience.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that there's going to be so many challenges across the board for all cultural institutions, certainly. But it's funny. Conversely, the sort of interactive technologies that we have within our exhibitions are some of the things that are giving us the most anxiety. Right? Are people going to be touching buttons? Are they going to be wanting to touch screens? How are we going to manage that inside our galleries, as opposed to these more sort of inert things where you walk around and you see things and you're just sort of within yourself? When you're starting to touch, when you're getting your hands on things, these interactives that we're all kind of embracing, how do we manage that within this new context is one thing, just from a practical perspective. And then I think as much as we all really do, we just can't wait to break out of this moment. I think that some of this is going to be with us. I think inevitably, and we, cultural organizations are going to be needing to plan to go beyond their physical facilities for the long term. And that's not all bad necessarily. I mean, what's happening right now it's bad. There's nothing good about it. But there are some things that we're learning as we're managing it that will have benefits beyond this moment. So we are doing as much remote programming as possible. And we're reaching audiences beyond our, that we've never reached before. And that's fantastic. And we're going to keep doing that, and we're going to attempt to build on that. And that's been really exciting for us to be able to meet those audiences and to sort of find that hunger out there and take even baby steps right now so that we can meet those needs. So that's great. And that's going to be with us, and we're sort of excited to build on that.
I was going to say, just to piggyback on what Barbara was saying, we're in the middle of designing an exhibition that does involve some audio, and right now it still involves audio you have to touch and put to your ear. And all of our discussions are about, okay, when we open this in a year, will that be appropriate? Will people feel comfortable? And not only that, but it's sort of the science side, with medicine, as we learn how to deal with it and what's okay and what's not okay, that'll affect our design as well. So it's sort of like a really sort of learning curve in terms of understanding as we come out of this. I know something completely random that we didn't anticipate happened to one of our projects. We were working on a VAC museum with one of the top contemporary artists right now. We're about to start work on it. And unfortunately, that's been postponed. A lot to do with people flying, because it's for the international art community. And if the international art community can't come, it changes everything. So a lot of also about the type of visitors and who visits will affect it. Not only sort of lots of museums are local, but some of them rely on international visitors. So we're sort of looking at some of our projects that are being affected from that perspective. On the silver lining, as Barbara mentioned, it means smaller groups. It means less overcrowding. It means being able to see everything clearly. I mean, I was just in the Louvre in July, and it was abysmal experience, talking about what Bevan was discussing, and sort of like how you navigate spaces and how it makes you feel. It's dreadful. It's like the worst experience ever. So I'm looking forward to there being less people and more space to see and enjoy. So I always feel there's a flip side to everything. And then we're looking at docents taking people around, maybe not touchscreen, not explaining things with touchscreen, but again, harnessing technology to tell the same story with more use of human touch and a guide.
I still go back. I still think a lot of visitors in a lot of exhibitions do like looking. They like being delivered information, entertainment. I can watch a really good film on a little tiny screen. It doesn't matter if it absorbs me. So I think in some respect, one of the good things, one of the silver linings for me is maybe a lot of clients and maybe a lot of designers will think again about what they're doing and why they're doing it. But there's two big issues for me about the whole thing. The first is visitor confidence in group spaces. Is it really going to come back? You know what? None of us know. Nobody knows. Yes, okay, so Shanghai Disney is reopened to a limited degree. All the tickets sold out. But are people going to mass flock to the same extent? In the attractions market, it's a really big thing, because these theme parks are expensive to build. It needs a lot of visitors and a lot of spend. So the first thing for me is visitor confidence, and we just don't know. And to answer your question, Abigail, in terms of designing for the visitor, you have to design as if it's now. You've got to deal with COVID-19 now, because the chances are in a year's time, when your exhibition opens, it's still going to be an issue. Because one thing is, this isn't going to go away. It's going to be a regular thing, and it's with us for many, many years. But the biggest single problem I have looking forward, and again, I don't have the answer, is investment or lack of. The money's disappearing. And I'm already hearing, we're very fortunate at the moment. We've got a number of very big projects that are funded, invested, the clients are moving ahead. Touch wood, we haven't had any cancellations of any projects yet, and we're working on site. But talking to some of the guys who are working in business development of some of the new ideas and new projects, the investment is disappearing. So the ideas are there, but nobody's willing to put the money forward. And that's going to be the real big issue. It's going to be the lack of cash. And that's where I fear really for the cultural institutions, because we've got some great museums, large and small. I think the larger museums, in some cases, maybe it will force them to rethink, which is good. I love small, medium-sized museums. I fear for the lack of funding. That's the one problem for me. I think there's going to be some nasty effects. So, those
the Charles Dickens, Kevin, did you see the Charles Dickens Museum in London? That's like on its last legs. They have it on their website looking for funding.
If I was really honest, I think actually a lot of museums were on their last leg. And I think this is where you hit into a discussion about you know, the government's role in funding a lot of these institutions. And it's, you know, I've been involved in big museums for years and years. It comes in and out. Do public pay? Do they not pay? Do they, you know, the Natural History Museum, I think I went through 5 iterations in 10 years of paying or not paying. And it's a big, big thing. Don't let our culture die.
You know, Bevan, you began to speak about how some of the technology you've integrated into different spaces or have learned from in different spaces have affected accessibility and universal design, and how we can create spaces that respond to the needs of many different people. And I wanted to ask, you know, in terms of data and information gathering and things like that, how have you tailored the work of the design practice? And then in the exhibition context as well, how does that come into play?
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting. We recently completed the renovation or renewal of the Ford Foundation Center for Social Justice, which is Roach Dinkley building over near the UN here in New York. And it's a very special modernist building, which was, you know, as an Irish architect, was terrifying touching another Irish architect's architecture. You know, we took on this sort of challenge, and really the focus for the organization of the Ford Foundation was to create an equitable building that was open and welcoming to all people. And this idea of like dignity for all sort of permeated through every single design decision that we made. We set up a set of like guiding principles at the start of this project that talked about you know, making views and access to the garden for everybody, for the public, for people who worked in the building, transparency so that you saw what was going on in the building, because many philanthropic organizations sort of feel closed doors and what's happening behind that. They really wanted to sort of change that. But really at the core of all of the changes we made was creating a space that everybody could enter, everybody could use. It had a range of restrooms for, you know, depending on where you wanted to go, like you always felt welcome and included. And that sort of idea of equity in architecture was like really the key. All of the doors open, like touchless, they have sensors. So we have like push openers at the front door so that, you know, now I think that will even be better for people as they're coming in. And again, just sort of opening up this sort of idea of a welcoming environment. I think that sort of idea of it really being integrated into what you do as opposed to an add-on, and even something that you think about, like it should just be happening. Every space that we design, it should just be part of what we do.
Yep.
And this goes way beyond meeting code. This is not about ADA. This is not about checking your box that you've got your 5-foot turning radius in your bathrooms. This is about creating spaces for people.
Yeah.
And so they, as an organization, really, I think, have really upheld the values of what it means to sort of live in a community and be welcomed and to be equal. So I think it was a very powerful sort of statement by an organization like that to sort of rework this very iconic building to really meet the needs of their future community.
Mm-hmm. If I can just jump in, I mean, this is something that we've been thinking about a lot at Museum of the Moving Image over the past year or so. We're in the early stages of completely reconceptualizing our core exhibition, which is now called Behind the Screen, and it's a great exhibition. It's been seen by millions of people, and it's our primary teaching tool, and it's our primary outlet for our permanent collection, and it will remain so, whatever the new core exhibition is. But we sort of tinkered around the edges, thinking, oh, do we just want to update things because our subject matter, obviously, moving image has changed so much in the past decades. Do we tinker around the edges, or do we knock it down and start again? And after a lot of feedback and a lot of discussions with various stakeholders and internal discussions, we decided that the best method for us overall was to knock it down and start again, you know, conceptually. And not just because our subject matter has changed, but also because the sort of museological experience has changed. And this notion of accessibility that we tried to do as best as we can within our current core exhibition, but it was not founded on those principles. To kind of build on what you were saying, Bevan, that it's like organically from the ground up, so that you're thinking about an experience that is available to as many people as possible, and you're not taking an exhibition and retrofitting it into something that invites people in. And that's what we're in the midst of, in thinking about that and taking these very sort of slow steps to envision an experience, a 15,000 square foot experience that is our sort of signature, right? It's our main experience that people come and see, and making that as inviting as possible, and inviting people with different learning modalities and physical abilities to be able to enjoy it equally. That is not an easy thing to do for any institution. And I just want to raise here another issue of accessibility is about cultural organizations' ability to create those experiences. And I think that we are all, as designers, storytellers in physical spaces, being held to a high standard, and we should be, but that takes money.
Yeah.
Right. And especially, well, I don't even want to think about what's going to happen now, sort of after this crisis that we're in, and what the landscape looks like. But even before that, different cultural organizations were positioned very, very differently to be able to access the kinds of tools that they need to create those experiences. And in some ways, those kinds of constraints breed creativity. You can think about it in a positive way, but it's also really, really difficult, because in addition to all the other things that you're fundraising for, it's sort of building all of that in. So there's lots of challenges. I'm not complaining about those challenges. I'm just saying that they're there, and we're really engaged in that at the moment. And I'm excited to see kind of where we go over the next 5 years in bringing that dream to reality.
One of the things in terms of accessibility that we've been thinking about recently in our last few projects is language. And a lot of the institutions we've been working with have wanted things in multiple languages. So looking at how technology can handle that to make, as Bevan mentioned, the experience really enjoyable and accessible, whether you're speaking Spanish, Chinese, Russian, English, has been something that we've been dealing with right now, especially when it comes to media. So really making sure that it's an enriched, holistic experience from a language perspective, as well as Bevan also mentioned, like the accessibility. But in terms of technology, interactivity, or just understanding what you can and can't touch, we have people who are completely tech savvy all the way down to haven't really used much technology. So whenever we're designing these experiences, we have to take that into account and make sure, again, that they're leaving the museum having thoroughly enjoyed and felt immersed in everything, and not feared going and interacting with things. So it's sort of demystifying and making all of our spaces and experiences very accessible and open to.
That's a very, very important point to end on as well. I'm glad, you brought that up, and I'm very hopeful that our cultural institutions will survive this intact and emerge even better. And when they do, I'm really excited to see the work that all of you do going forward. So thanks so much for joining. I think it's a really exciting topic, and really timely, given that we're in an inflection point with this kind of work.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, Abby, Bevan, Barbara, and Kevin, for your encouraging conversation and a look behind the exhibits. We enjoyed celebrating NYC by Design and Global Design with our industry associates and their impactful presentations. Thank you all for joining us. Design Talks Now will be available on the Design Pavilion website, and new programming will continue through the month to come. You can also find information on our topics and presenters on our website, so please visit us there. And for now, stay safe, stay smart. Design stands together.